This is Redefining Trade, the podcast brought to you by TradeWindow to shine a light on the future of trade. Every month, our host Peter Foyston will be joined by those who are shifting the dial for trade across New Zealand, Australia, and Asia. We will be exploring the latest thinking on trade innovation, supply chain management, export trends, digital trade, blockchain, trade law, trade in the face of COVID-19, and we'll be opening a whole new window on the world of exporting.
Okay, well, today's guest is Dave Christie, who holds an exciting role at Tainui Group Holdings, the commercial arm of Waikato, Tainui, and New Zealand. Today I'm going to find out a little bit more about what he does and some of the work he's been up to over the past 12 months, specifically what this means for New Zealand exporters and the advancement of the supply chain infrastructure. So first, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter.
And we'll just launch into it. You're the Director of Supply Chain for Tainui Group Holdings, TGH.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your career journey so far.
Thanks for that, Peter. Hey, well, I'm a bit of a supply chain tragic, in truth be told. Over 35 years in logistics and supply chain. Started in the New Zealand Army as a logistics officer and got plenty of opportunities to grow my skill set there with 2 tours overseas. And then moved into PricewaterhouseCoopers, supply chain consulting, and then I got a chance to work with some really big blue chip brands, and I spent some time with the warehouse, heading up the supply chain for warehouse stationery, and then into Fonterra, where we created a bit of improved the supply chain between Fonterra New Zealand and the Fonterra's branded businesses around the globe. And then from there into a company called Coda, which is, in logistics world, we call it a 4PL, which is fourth party logistics provider, which manages data, mainly, doesn't have any trucks or assets, it just manages, and it did all of Fonterra's and another 100-odd companies' logistics. And then while I was there, I got the opportunity to look at Tainui Group Holdings. And I guess what excited me about that was 2 things. Firstly, the project, the Ruakura project, which we'll come on to shortly, is something which I think is going to be a game changer for supply chain and logistics in New Zealand, and to be part of that I thought would be quite exciting. But also secondly, through all my career that I've just talked through, I've had very little involvement with the iwi of New Zealand, the Māori. So I thought it would be a golden opportunity for me to learn more about the iwi, learn more about Māori and Māori conditions and what they're trying to achieve. And so that's another thing that really excited me. So when I got the opportunity, I leapt at it.
So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what your job at TGH involved. And I think it would also be helpful for people, you were talking about the interaction with the iwi and the Māori, how this whole project kind of came about, and obviously your critical role in the whole thing, but ultimately in where it's kind of heading.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Look, the Waikato Tainui had a settlement with the Crown, the Rapato settlement, which is the Treaty of Waitangi settlement, back in 1995, and the Ruakura area, which this development's based on, was part of the land that was given back by the Crown back to Waikato Tainui, and it accounts for about 40% of the land that they received back in 1995. And then about late 90s, the CEO of Tainui Group Holdings at that time had this bit of a vision that when he looked at the map of where this was, he saw the main railway line that goes between Auckland and Tauranga going through this piece of land, and he saw the new motorway that was going to be developed, the new State Highway 1, bordering the eastern border of it, and he thought, perfect place for an inland port. And so Mike Pohio, who was his name, he came up with the idea, and that's it's taken 14 years from the gestation of that idea through to where we are right now, where we're actually there's diggers on the ground, there's earth being moved, and we're actually starting to build what was his original concept way back then.
Sometimes great ideas take a little bit of time to come to fruition, but you mentioned inland port.
Yeah.
Okay, so so it feels a little bit like an oxymoron.
Yeah, it does.
So tell me what that is and how that works and why this is a great idea.
Yeah, look, hey, it's a really good point, because a lot of my friends, when I say that, they think, well, a ship's going to be coming up the Waikato River or something like that. And I say, the simple answer is no to that. An inland port is grown over the last 20 odd years as a global phenomena, and because as you can imagine, seaports, whether they be here in New Zealand or offshore, they get quite constrained for space, and often they get constrained because they've been built and created in an urban environment, and so the urban development takes around them and they can't grow or expand. So what seaports often do is they look to kind of buy land or secure land inland, and as their seaports growing, they use the inland port to flow goods to and from, rather than having products sitting and taking up space and time on port. So it's an extension of the seaport, but it's often in an inland area closer to industry and to capture all the flows and the cargo there.
Right, and so how does the Ruakura Superhub kind of fit in with, you know, the ports of Auckland or the Tauranga port, and how does that kind of mix together?
Yeah.
What's the big idea here?
Yeah, well, the big idea, and this is what I love about this opportunity, is it comes back to a New Zealand Inc. thing. So can I just jump? I'll go to a bigger picture first.
Absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So in New Zealand, we're a small little country down the bottom of the world, and effectively most of our trade is international. I think over 80% of New Zealand's exports go across the equator. So we're intrinsically tied. A lot of our economic wealth as a country is intrinsically tied to those global supply chains. And we're competing against huge multinationals, you know, the Nestle's, the Friesland Campinas, the Procter & Gamble's of the world, for typically our food products on shelves in supermarkets and around the world. And what the disadvantage we have as a nation is that because of our distance, our lead time to market can be anywhere from 3-4 weeks up to 12 weeks, depending which market we're talking about. Whereas they're competing against players who are lucky if they're 1 week, they might only be 48 hours from the shelf. And so while we might have fantastic products, you know, our food products, our agricultural products are brilliant. If you're a retailer, what you want to know is that when your shelf's empty, you can get resupplied just like that. And so this is one of the weaknesses for New Zealand. And what COVID's really highlighted recently is just how fragile our global supply chains are. So that's the big picture. And then if you kind of bring that down to New Zealand, we've got 3 generic supply chains. So we've got an import supply chain, a domestic supply chain, which moves it all through New Zealand, and then an export supply chain. And traditionally, these 3 supply chains don't talk to each other. They all use different assets, and all of those assets effectively are wasteful. So just as a slight example of that, I'll give 2 actually. New Zealand's a net exporter. So for every 1 import container that comes into New Zealand, 3 leave New Zealand. Wow. And so as a consequence, there's an imbalance, and that's therefore wasteful, because the shipping companies have to bring in those 2 extra empty containers in order to meet our export demands. It's actually worse than that, because typically our exports are food, and therefore they're temperature controlled, and yet our imports are consumer goods. And so they come in 40-foot ambient containers, and a lot of our outbound containers are reefer containers, which are temperature controlled containers. So the imbalance is even more. And then another example from the domestic supply chain is that with all of the consumer goods companies in New Zealand, well, the majority of them being located in Auckland, every single day there's this flow of trucks out of Auckland to all the different parts of North Island, but also through to the South Island as well. And then all of these trucks need to get back to Auckland to pick up the goods again, to then go and repeat that process. And it's just this ongoing cycle. 40% of those trucks that come back to Auckland are empty. So you see the trucks heading back into Auckland are often carrying air, which is a waste. It's not great from a sustainability point of view. It's not great from an economic point of view either. So long-winded answer to your question there, Peter. But what Ruakura does is that what we're trying to do with Ruakura is we're trying to create this infrastructure which brings those 3 supply chains together, all in one location. And the principle we're applying here is aggregation. We're looking to aggregate supply chain flows. Right. And by aggregating all those flows, we'll grow scale. And as you grow scale, you can drive efficiencies, productivity, and you can actually then do some really lovely benefits that flow out of it around sustainability as well.
And in terms of the kind of, just to give a sense of the scale of what you're dealing with, so it's taken 14 years from a great idea to diggers in the ground. Yeah. And when it's completed, A, how long is it expecting until the diggers head home? And B, when they leave, what will someone like myself, if you're going down the highway, are you going to suddenly see a massive group of buildings? Is it a bunch of warehouses? Is it an airline? Is it an airport strip? Just what is going to be left behind?
Yeah, well, so, and actually it's a really good question, because ultimately the Ruakura area is about 480 hectares.
Okay.
So just as I didn't know much about this before I came into Ruakura. That's roughly the area of Auckland CBD. So imagine the landmass of Auckland CBD.
I hope it's flatter.
It's flatter. It's a lot
Okay,
flatter.
so this is good. Otherwise, it'd be a lot of work for those diggers.
Exactly. So no, it's very flat, and at the moment it's predominantly farmland. So it's been rezoned through a court of inquiry process into industrial and logistics and inland port. And so when you come down the new State Highway 1, which has been called the Waikato Expressway,
Yeah.
You're driving south. You'll look to your right and you'll see, as you indicated, lots of warehouses and a light industry, which will look like warehouses as well. And you'll just see very large buildings interconnected with what we call the inland port, because the inland port will be connected via the rail link. Mm-hmm. So what you'll see here is large masses of containers, which is the import and the export containers, moving to and from the warehouses, making that trade a lot more efficient, a lot more effective. And then you'll see these containers moving by rail to Auckland Port, to Port of Tauranga, and actually taking the trucks off the road,
Right.
and putting them on rail. We predict by the time the full development's finished, there'll be 65,000 truck movements taken off the road, which I think is about 12 to 16,000 tonnes of carbon emissions, reduction as a result of that.
And timeline for when we can all breathe easier?
Well, so we're starting phase 1 now, which is 90 hectares of the 480.
Okay.
And so we'll have that 90 hectares open for business in March, April next year. The inland port will be open. The service centre will be close followed by our first tenant who's signed up with us will be open in August, September next year. We think it'll take us 5 or so years to get that, 5 to 10 years to get that developed. The full 480 hectares we think will probably take it's probably a 30-year journey.
Right.
Yeah. Which is the advantage of it, because the land is owned by the Waikato Tainui iwi, and the major difference, say, between them and any other property landlord and property developer is they have this very long view of investment. It's multi-generational. So what's great about what we're doing at Ruakura is it's not just a thing about can we maximise the dollars for every square metre of land. They're looking at how do we make the water cleaner that's coming out through that area. How do we improve the habitat for the native species, the bats, the eels, the tuna, and how do we make it a better place for people to live and work? So they really take a long-term view of it, which I think is fantastic.
And the area today you're saying is primarily farmland.
Yeah.
And is it dairy? Is it vegetable? Is it?
It's a bit of both. It's there's crops are grown. So it's actually quite fertile ground there. So there's some maize have been grown there, which have is now finished. There is cattle being farmed on there. A bit of dairy.
Eventually that'll all move away as
Correct,
the vision
Correct.
gets organized.
Yeah.
But it isn't a kind of a mixed thing. It's not housing and development. It's or is it? I'm just trying to picture.
I'm with you.
Downtown Auckland.
Yeah.
And that kind of space, which is really massive, and the vision here is incredible. I'm just trying to see, is there any edge to this vision?
Yeah, well, there is. What's happened recently, and as we all know, there's bigger challenges across New Zealand on housing. So, we are in discussions with government and with Hamilton City Council about is there a housing opportunity that sits here? Because clearly we think once it's fully developed there'll be between 6,000 to 12,000 employees.
Well, that's the thing. Suddenly you want to make it so that there's places for these people to live and be quite close.
Yeah, exactly. And because we're adjacent to the University of Waikato as well, we've got a zone that we're calling the knowledge zone, and hopefully the intention is that we have offices and workspaces there that are tied to kind of helping advance innovation and development, new ideas.
And so, as you create the inland port, as you start to aggregate and more effectively utilize, I presume there's both a move to rail, which is in general allows more scale and certainly sustainability. But also there's, with the aggregation, I presume the idea is that you're helping to match some of this unbalanced that's going on around, both domestically and import to export, so that you can more efficiently move these things around. But who who are your tenants? When you say a tenant
Yeah.
that's coming in,
Yeah.
who would they be and what would they be doing?
Right. Just before I answer that question, do you need a job? Because I mean, you just articulated it perfectly. You know, the fact you picked up that the work between the import flows, the export flows.
Well, that's because I was just listening to what you were saying. You're the magician here.
So if you think about import-export flows, clearly the Waikato has a large number of exporters. There's the dairy exporters, there's the meat exporters. So we're hoping to attract a number of those organisations, if not their manufacturing facilities, because typically those production facilities are in where the catchment area is.
Yeah.
But more their warehousing facilities. So as a staging point before it gets put across into a container and shipped offshore. From an inbound perspective, that market's quite fragmented, but the largest importers in New Zealand are typically retailers.
Right.
We're talking to
the usual suspects.
And hoping to get some wins in that space there. And then the third tranche of people we're talking to are logistics companies. So Peter Baker Transport, or PBT Express, I think they're called now. Mm-hmm. They're a transport company, but also an express company, courier company, and they've come because they can see our vision that this is going to become. We think the centre of gravity of all cargo flows, freight flows, are through the North Island, and so if you're in the centre there, you're able to maximise and capitalise on those opportunities.
And I can understand how the seaports onto train to the inland. Yeah. How should we be thinking about from an aviation standpoint, or is this really more of a at least at a starting point, or maybe who knows at which point, is this more of a rail sea game as opposed to an aviation game?
Well, it's funny you say that, because at the moment our focus is rail sea, and then the road interconnections. But as you'll be aware of, Peter, that there's been huge growth through COVID of B2C, the consumer online shopping. And I was reading an article this morning out of North America, and most transport companies, or they call them last mile distribution companies, are struggling to cope with the capacity, the increase in demand, but also the demand from the consumer of knowing where their product is in the last mile and getting you up to date, and also the delivery, because like in the North America, right, lots of deliveries are to apartment buildings. Yeah. And actually I heard someone made from Comvita on that panel I was on just the other day. There was the customer manager for Comvita. She was saying one of the challenges they're having is they deliver some honey to a customer in say America, and it gets delivered to the door in a high-rise apartment. Well, there's no letterbox, so the people come home and their honey's not there because someone else thought they might want it more than there. So that's that, and actually this plays nicely into this whole piece. There's a growing focus on digitization in the supply chain. It's happening as a result of the B2C demand. And actually, how does the supply chain get more digitised in order to provide consumer with this real-time information tracking that they're looking for? And we know that the big players in the world, the Amazons and the like, they're creating these digital tools which allow, like a courier driver to kind of scan that. They get given a unique code, and they then go and put the Comvita honey or whatever the product is, inside the doorway. And that's all videoed and from a safety point of view. So that's the end of this very long supply chain. So come back to your question around airlines. Look, it's not part of us at the moment, but we do believe that with the growth of B2C, there will be this growth of last mile delivery, and clearly drones are going to be part of that in the future. Right. Hamilton Airport's just 10 kilometres down the road. Mm-hmm. So while there's no firm plans, we've got some just thinking that we're starting to permeate at this stage. And
the ownership of the TGH, is it public-private, or is it all iwi, or?
Yeah. So TGH is owned, is purely 100% iwi. We're owned by Waikato Tainui, and we are the commercial arm of Waikato Tainui. So our mandate is to grow the economic wealth of the tribe. And we support the tribe by paying dividends back to them on an annual basis. Yeah.
And you've mentioned a few things about the really long-term focus, the broader picture. So as you are making some of the choices about how you're kind of creating the commercial side of things, what are some of these aspects that obviously play into the social aspect, but ensuring that the total picture serves the iwi in the way that they want it going forward into the future. What are some of those? Can you give me one or two examples of some of the choices you're making? Because sometimes just understanding something that has a slightly different focus than your traditional, for profit only kind of commercial organization, there can be some really interesting learnings back and forth, and best practices obviously evolve over time. And I'm just interested if there's some examples there.
So under our kaiteka tāngata, we have 4 levers. We have cultural, we have social, we have environmental, which typically when you think about sustainability, people think purely about environmental, and then we have economic. From an environmental perspective, we're kind of saying that this needs to be the same or even better than conditions than what we experienced. In fact, that's part of the reason why we've got a huge network of swales, and we've got a 10-hectare wetland. And the objective of the swales and the wetland is that once the water comes out of the wetland, it's almost drinkable, and it's at a condition where it's absolutely fantastic and it's improved. We're increasing the amount of waterways for the native eels. We're planting 1 million trees for the bats. There's a whole lot of different things that we're doing to try and grow the environment. What that means for a tenant is they kind of get the benefits of living in that ecosystem. But we're also saying, as a minimum, the buildings that you're going to be in have to be a minimum of Green Star 4. And that means that they've got to be sustainable to an extent. And what we're really pleased to see is some tenants are coming to us and going, well, actually, we want to go to Green Star 6. Green Star 4, we're going beyond that, which means solar's on the roof, and we're very excited by that because we are looking at having solar panels on every roof. So when you're driving down the motorway and you look at these, you'll see solar panels on every roof, and we're aiming to have a microgrid there. So we'll create our own power generation as well.
Wow. And is it windy enough for the...
No.
Well,
no, I don't think so. No.
Go for the sun instead.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. To move back to something a little bit, you talked about, and I think this is part of sustainability as well, digitization, automation. Yeah. How are you, are you thinking of having warehouses, and I've been in places that are I don't know the technical term, but I call them kind of black warehouses, where everything is automated, so you don't have to, from a health and safety standpoint, it's much safer because big warehouses, machinery moving around can be quite a dangerous environment. But also even from a sustainability, of course, you don't need to worry about lights, you don't need to do any of that kind of thing as well. Are those the types of things that you're looking at?
Yeah. In truth, those decisions will come down to the tenants themselves.
Okay.
But what we're doing is trying to create an environment that enables the decisions, enables the tenants to actually achieve those outcomes. And so from that digitalisation point of view, we've kind of cast our minds to the future and said, if you're a tenant, and if you're living in a world that's completely digitised, and what we mean by that is, are they using blockchain? How are they connecting to it? The customers are probably wanting real-time information about where they are.
Yeah.
And to the point you then raised is they're probably wanting to increase the use of automation. So at the moment, automation happens within a distribution centre or a warehouse, typically through Wi-Fi nodes through the site, and they can be there can be issues with that around slowness of
I've that in my office. I'm not even trying about
exactly.
Distribution centre.
So we know the next level or next stage of evolution is 5G, and there is case studies overseas where warehouses have now got 5G nodes instead of Wi-Fi nodes, and that's expressly for the automation that's occurring because of the low latency, high speed. So we're looking at having an embedded 5G network through the whole precinct, which the tenants will be able to have access to, which supports their digitalisation strategies. Right. And it might be that anything they're wanting to do, because a lot of these players are importers, exporters, and this is probably where it links in with TradeWindow, right?
Thanks for the plug. Appreciate
it. Well, they because if you're linked in with TradeWindow, what you're doing is you're going from manual import-export documentation to automated and digitalised.
Right.
And so therefore you want that to process quickly, efficiently, and so then 5G, well, you can still do it on Wi-Fi and hardwire. 5G we think is the way of the future because of just the speed and the volume it can deal with.
And what kind of support, if any, are you getting from different levels of government in this whole thing?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like, whoa, this is a big project, thousands of jobs,
Yep.
incredible vision and opportunity. So where are our friends in government coming in on this?
Yeah, look, I'm really pleased to say that we're getting strong support from central government, but also local government, Hamilton City Council as well. So the first roads that we're currently constructing at the moment, we did that under the Provincial Growth Fund,
Right.
and we got money or funding both from central government and from Hamilton City Council, and then we've funded the rest of that. And then a lot of the infrastructure development for this first stage of the precinct, we've got under the CIP funding. Yeah, I think they shovel ready.
Oh, shovel ready.
Shovel ready, yeah.
Okay. And is this really shovel ready?
Well, actually, we've had
we know it's digger ready.
Yeah. Well, we've had the Minister of Transport recently, and feedback from him has been very, very positive. And what they're seeing with us is we said we're ready to go, and we're demonstrating with all the diggers and a few shovels that we're ready to go.
Yeah, I bet you brought the shovels out
Yes,
as you
exactly.
came in, got out of his car.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly.
Get him working a bit.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah. Well, ratepayer, taxpayer, right? Paying for it.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, that's great. Sounds like we've got a pretty good understanding of this project and where it's at. I wouldn't say it's at the beginning because it's been 14 years in,
Yes, exactly.
but it sure sounds like it's a lot more than 14 years away from the end, if there ever is one there. But maybe we could switch gears a little bit in terms of what are some of the bigger supply chain trends that are impacting New Zealand. I can imagine a few that might be going on.
Yep.
And what do you think these trends mean for both particularly exporters, but exporters, importers, and I'd be interested in both, immediate trends, but where you think those trends might have a longer term impact.
Yeah. Hey, look, that's a really fascinating question. There's a few common themes coming through. I think the first one is well, in supply chain terms, we call it the bullwhip effect. And what that means is every supply chain is an interconnected ecosystem. There's no supply chain kind of stands on its own. And so what happens is classic systems thinking theory. If something happens in one area, you have a bigger and disproportional effect somewhere else in the system.
Right.
A classic example of that was the Evergreen, which then turned sideways on the Suez Canal. And blocked that up. And I remember talking to an exporter at the time saying, "Oh, that's okay. My goods don't come from Europe. They come from China." And what he was missing was that the whole ecosystem's connected. So with that blockage in the Suez Canal, there's this huge superhighway of ships between Europe, China, and across to North America. And as a result of that blockage of the kind of the European end or the African end of that superhighway, there's a connection point for New Zealand in the middle. So 80% of New Zealand ships that come to New Zealand coast go up through this superhighway. We connect to the superhighway at two places, either at Singapore Port or at Tanjung Palapas, which is a port in Malaysia. And if you've got some issues with your superhighway, then you'll have connection issues here at that point of the T. And so that's exactly what happened. There was congestion issues at these transship ports, which flowed down through to New Zealand. So, that created a bullwhip effect. We had ships missing ports, we had ships changing services, we've got increased costs, so all of the things that could go wrong in the supply chain happen. And on top of that, we then had domestic problems of ports, and we've got ships sitting out in the harbour. Our biggest trading partner across the ditch, they had industrial action in their ports. So it was like this accumulation of issues, which therefore meant for exporters, they couldn't get containers. When they did get the container couldn't get on the ship. When they could get the container onto the right ship, the ship didn't sail as it said it would, or it turned up late, and the costs were going through the roof. And so that goes back to that earlier point I said at the start, where our supply chains are quite fragile and exposed. So there's a number of things, supply chain principles that you'd apply to mitigate that. One would be around on your inbound supply chain. You would look for dual supply, rather than just having one supplier who gives you 80% of your goods. You're trying to mitigate that. And there's a term that's coming through which is called nearshoring or home-shoring. And so, because most people in the good old bad days, pre-COVID, is they use this concept called just-in-time.
Yeah.
And effectively, and this is the way I talk to the managing directors and CEOs, you could go and say, we want to grow over here, and we want to grow these products in these markets. And they could go, yep, cool, we'll go and do it. Because the supply chain had the capacity and the efficiency to go and do it. Post-COVID, it's not there. And so CEOs and MDs are being constrained about where they can grow, and they need to make sure the supply chain is fixed. So therefore, how do you mitigate the risk? you maybe bring some of your supply nearer to your current location. Clearly, there's been a growth of inventories, inbound inventories to buffer that supply variability, and finished goods inventories to buffer the outbound variability, which is meant for businesses. There's an increase in working capital, which is significant if a business also then wants to kind of grow its businesses. So the planning processes that across the end-to-end supply chain, all the way in the conversion processes within the companies, and then the export processes offshore, is an area I think where, especially for SMEs, there's a huge opportunity for taking it to the next stage, so that companies can better understand where their risks and challenges are and plan for them rather than just react to them when they smack them in the face.
And do you think there's a growing opportunity, maybe if you're talking about nearshoring, could people be counting as nearshoring like in New Zealand now?
Yeah, totally. And in fact, a lot of companies I've been talking to are looking at, these are all jargon terms, right? But they're vertically integrating. And one of the things they're looking to do is, rather than just doing assembly, could they do some manufacture of those critical parts, which is so critical to their item that they make or the product they make. And if you can't do that, is there someone else in New Zealand who could potentially do that for you rather than yourselves? As a minimum, would there be someone in, say, Australia who could do it for you? Because at least you're in a supply chain position that's not as exposed as, say, someone from China or Europe or something.
Right. So it sounds like there may be some possibly longer term inefficiencies if there's inventories growing up, because the whole idea of just in time was that you could minimize your inventory, minimize the cash flow impact on things, maximize the total picture, but which is, for overall having greater inventories less efficient. On the flip side, though, maybe there's a bit of a silver lining in this cloud where New Zealand in particular can really maybe either regain or gain some skills, expertise, and be able to grow the country in different ways than what we were looking at before. Do you see that kind of longer term impact, or do you think people are going to try and go back? We've noticed in some cases companies digitize pretty quickly. Now all of a sudden they're saying, but maybe as we come out of this crisis, maybe we can go back to the quote unquote good old days.
Well, actually, there's no one, it's a crystal ball, right? But the global commentators are predicting that this shipping capacity shortage will likely take 6 to 12 months to resolve.
Right.
So, and what's really fascinating about the original question around trends is what's caused this capacity shortage. Well, it's the fact that people can't travel. So the people can't fly. They've spent more time at home, so the money they would have spent on flying, they've actually sat on their computers, and they've gone and consumed. And so the consumer goods which are flying around the planet now has gone through the roof, and there hasn't been enough shipping capacity or container capacity to meet that. And so the question is, and someone asked me, well, when's this going to stop? I said, well, you tell me when everyone's going to get back on planes, and I'll tell you when this will start to trend down. And best projection 6 to 12 months. So to answer your latter question, I think there is a golden opportunity for New Zealand businesses, and some of the companies that I've been talking to, and their issue, the thing that they wanted to focus on wasn't so much about the supply chain challenges. Those are kind of just tactical fixes. They're going, what they're experiencing is 2 or 3 or 4 times growth in the horizon, because as a result of this consumption and this demand, they're going, how do I actually set my business up to actually meet the growth that I can see over the next year or two? And that for me is the really exciting part, because actually rather than the supply chain being just a silent partner in that, if you can have the supply chain get up to that lead team, up to that boardroom table conversation level, the supply chain can enable that growth and can enable the businesses to hit their the big growth numbers that they keep talking about. So that's the exciting part for me as a supply chain practitioner.
Well, big growth sounds good.
Yeah.
Overcoming problems sounds better. And obviously the kind of the coming of that together, what whole TGH just sounds like a pretty amazing project that has lots of both short-term, medium-term, and long-term benefits going on, which is, I guess now I'm starting to really understand why you grabbed this opportunity to be a part of it. And so thanks so much for joining me for the chat today. I've learned a lot, really enjoyed it. And to our listeners, we'd love to hear any questions or suggestions you may have for Redefining Trade. And so look out for our contact details in the show notes or email us at redefiningtrade@tradewindow.io. And thanks so much again.
Not a problem. It's been great to meet you.
Thanks.
You, Peter.
This has been Redefining Trade by TradeWindow with our host Peter Foyston. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit subscribe and keep an eye out for the next episode.